I would like to start today by thanking Jared Taylor for inviting me to speak at American Renaissance. Being invited to speak at AmRen is a great honour, as the conference is widely regarded as the best and most prestigious nationalist event of the year. AmRen is not only a perfect example of professionalism and nationalist exceptionalism, but it is also graced by the best nationalist speakers the world has to offer. Obviously, it is with great sadness that I cannot be there in person. What makes this even more disappointing is that we were fortunate enough to host Jared Taylor earlier this year at the Patriotic Alternative Conference. Being in the company of Jared is always a great pleasure, and I wish I could have returned the kindness Jared showed to us by being there and meeting you all in person. Sadly, however, I am the most banned man in Europe, as the European Union has branded me Europe's most dangerous Nazi. I am banned from travelling to the US, Canada, and 29 European countries for 15 years. I am also banned from all mainstream social media, and worse still, I am not even allowed a bank account. The state and the private sector have done everything in their power to both silence me and break my will. I did, however, attempt to get to the US to be with you, but it came as no shock when my travel clearance was declined within minutes of my application being lodged. And in some ways, I should have expected such an outcome, not just because I am apparently the most dangerous man in the whole of Europe, but because few people have been as scathing of America and of American foreign and domestic policy as I have. In fact, I once referred to America as the fountain of all moral degeneracy that spews forth an endless stream of poison that goes on to infect and corrupt the rest of the world. And some people, mainly Americans, weren't happy about that statement. But when I talked of America, I think everyone present today knows what I meant. The America I was talking about is not Anglo-Saxon America. It is not the America of white picket fences and white nuclear families. It is not the America that was created by brave European pioneers and explorers. The America I was talking about is a perverse and twisted version of America, an America controlled by people who at first glance may look European, but are in fact alien to Europeans. Alien in terms of their ethnicity, but also alien in terms of their mindset. But they are not just alien, they are hostile, because many of them seem to be motivated by an atavistic hatred of people of European descent. And all of this led me to coin a new phrase, one that hopefully would be much clearer, much less confusing, and cause far less outrage to the Americans that we want to reach out to. And the new phrase that I now use to describe this twisted, degenerate, and anti-white America is the Judeo-American state. Because as we all know, America is not run by people of European descent. It is not controlled by the descendants of the brave explorers and pioneers who founded this nation. Unlike what we hear from the media, America is not controlled by pale and stale white men. America is controlled by a Jewish oligarchy that is comprised of the media, social media companies, the corporate sector, and the government itself. And it is this Jewish oligarchy from which that endless stream of poison that I mentioned earlier spews forth from. It is this Jewish oligarchy that has turned America into that aforementioned fountain of moral degeneracy. But it is interesting how this situation came about and how I ended up coming to this conclusion, as I was brought up in a world where America was always held up as the good guy, the global hero, the liberator, and the defender of freedom. So how did America become a global superpower? And how did so many nations become nothing more than vassal states of the US, bowing and scraping to leaders in Washington and slurping up every drop of filth pumped out by America's numerous anti-white propaganda outlets? And I want to be very clear on my position. I believe that America, now under the control of the Judeo-American state, has become the greatest threat, not only to people of European descent, but in fact, the greatest threat to all decent, strong, ethnocentric and moral people the world over, regardless of their race or ethnicity. Now, for some, that is a bold statement to make, and one that requires some qualification. And where best to start? Well, let's go back to 1945, because as I have unashamedly stated, I believe that the West's origin story was completely rewritten at the end of 1945. In fact, I would go as far as to state that the West experienced a second and false founding, one that took place at the end of the Second World War. And it was this false founding that was the beginning of the nightmare situation that we as people of European descent now face. And we must be very clear, this is a nightmare that we all face. If you are of European descent, no matter where you live, England, France, America, or even Australia, you face the same existential threat. You face the same anti-white narrative, and you face the same prospect of becoming a minority. Whether whites are indigenous people, or whether we are the ones who established colonies and built what would go on to become towering modern nations, we all face the prospect of becoming a minority in the near future. And not just a minority. If you look at the way minorities are treated, you might think that minority status would be a good thing. I mean, in Britain, it means you can turn up in a dinghy, and by the end of the day, you can find yourself lounging in the jacuzzi at a 5-star hotel. But don't be fooled. White people won't be getting any of that treatment. There will be no lounging in the all-expenses-paid jacuzzi for us. When we become a minority, we will become a hated and despised minority that not only has fewer rights than any other group, but in fact, we will become the group that all other groups will be encouraged to blame for the failings of the multicultural system that is imposed upon us. We face a nightmare future, a future where we are dispossessed of our birthright, a future where we are worse off than second-class citizens. And this is not some conspiracy theory. It is a very real conspiracy aimed at bringing about the end of our people. And this all began in 1945 with the West's second and false founding. The lies that underpinned this false founding were woven by devious minds that concocted a fantasy version of history where white men from Western nations went to war to crush fascism in the name of Western liberal democracy. And that lie was woven into every aspect of our lives and went on to become the poisonous propaganda taught to all white children. That our forefathers stormed the beaches of Normandy in order to fight for gay pride parades, trans rights, mass immigration, tolerance and diversity. And this false narrative also helped to establish the idea of America as the hero nation, the nation that brought freedom, justice, and democracy to a Europe that was under threat from the worst kind of evil imaginable. Homogenous, proud Europeans who supported the most evil ideology known to man: nationalism. But this false founding wasn't the only world-changing event that came about in 1945. And this false founding wasn't the only reason that Judeo-America became known as the hero nation, that all others must bow to and attempt to emulate. As the embers of the last great brothers' war cooled, the Cold War began. And during this era, political lines and allegiances would be redrawn. And not one, but two new global superpowers would emerge. To the east lay the USSR, the communist bloc that the West would characterize as the bad guy for the next 46 years. And make no mistake, the USSR and its Bolshevik government were bad guys. The USSR was built on the suffering of white Christian people, and millions of white Christians perished under the Bolsheviks, a government that was overwhelmingly Jewish. And wherever communism reared its head in Europe, it always seemed to contain that ethnic component. It was always implemented and controlled by groups that were disproportionately Jewish. And communism didn't bring about the utopia that it promised. Communism was, in fact, as we all know, a brutal and destructive force for people of European descent. Communist governments subjugated the people under their influence, bringing immense suffering and death, not only to Russia, but to all nations that lay behind the Iron Curtain. But it must be noted, these communist regimes inflicted suffering visibly and openly through show trials, executions, and the murderous gulag system that led to millions disappearing. This kind of brutal oppression is sickening. But at least it was obvious and openly visible. And as the Red Menace dominated the East, murdering millions of white Christians, fear spread throughout Western Europe of a potential invasion, and the spectre of a full-blown war between the communist East and the free West grew over time. This led to Western Cold War propaganda in which the USSR was seen as the bad guy, as the global threat. But wherever there is a bad guy, wherever there is a global threat, wherever there is evil, there must also be a good guy. There must also be a hero. And sadly, the hero in this story became America, and the counterbalance to communism in the East became Western liberal democracy. However, unfortunately, America was not the hero, and Western liberal democracy was not the force for good that it was painted to be. You see, if USSR and communism were one side of the coin, America and Western liberal democracy were sadly just the flip side of that coin. You see, the sad truth is the real counterbalance to communism had been defeated in that brothers' war, and the real resistance to the Bolshevik tyranny had been broken. The National Socialists in Germany, the Fascists in Italy, and the numerous other nationalist governments and groups across Eastern and Western Europe were the only ones that presented a true alternative to the Bolsheviks. But those nationalist groups were crushed, and their flags were dragged through the mud, not just by the communists in the East, but also by America and her allies in the West. And after the Second World War, whites in the West saw these two competing superpowers, the Jewish communists to the East and the Judeo-American liberals in the West. And in reality, neither of these powers had good intentions for those of European descent. And Western Europe
which was now effectively occupied by America, over time accepted the Judeo-American propaganda that America was the good guy, the hero in this story. And despite many within Western Europe having supported nationalist movements before the Second World War, these people were left with few options. And over time, they came to accept that American occupation was the preferable option to the USSR. After all, Western liberal democracy was a much easier sell than communism. You see, as I said earlier, communism was openly brutal and kept people in line with an ever-present threat of violence and brutalization. However, those selling Western liberal democracy came to Europe not with secret police, guns and gulags, but they came bearing gifts. A series of chalices, if you will, each one more alluring than the last. Each one of these chalices were laced with a poison. And as the 1960s advanced, those behind the Iron Curtain starved and struggled and lived under conditions that seemed horrifying to those on the western side of the Berlin Wall. However, those in the West were presented with every pleasure they could dream of. And those who ruled America ensured that these pleasures just kept on coming. America's new elite relentlessly pumped out their poisonous gifts, constantly thinking of new ways to titillate the masses, whilst at the same time devising ways to push the envelope ever further with the pleasures that had already been established. And as a result, those European nations that lay on the western side of the Iron Curtain willingly embraced the Judeo-American state as both a friend and a mentor, and happily took on the Judeo-American Western liberal values that America championed. The gifts of sexual liberation, free love, pornography, soap operas, feminism, and of course the mantra of do what makes you feel good were eagerly embraced. Yet these carefully packaged poisons slowly destroyed the people of each nation that embraced them, undermining the very fabric of society itself. These poisons attacked European culture and heritage, undermined masculinity and the traditional family, mocked religion and morality, and eventually turned even the fundamental laws of nature upon their heads. And as those in the East increasingly grew resentful of the brutal communist tyranny under which they lived, those in the West partied and cavorted and lived large, smiling and laughing as they obediently asked for more of the addictive poison that the Judeo-American state dished out. And eventually, the stalemate of the Cold War ended. Communism collapsed, and those in the East were happy to throw off the shackles of their communist oppressors and turn to something better. Family, folk and faith, whilst those in the West just kept indulging in their increasingly debased pleasures. With insane grins painted on their faces, they watched as their nations crumbled around them and their folk began to be reduced to a hated minority thanks to the values instilled in them by their greatest ally, their protector, the nation that stood for democracy and freedom. This brings to mind an old saying: it's easier to kill someone with kindness than with hostility. And whilst communism was openly brutal, those who emerged from behind the Iron Curtain were racially homogenous and had held on to their culture. Yet those who had accepted the kindness of America were giving up their culture willingly and were becoming victims of an ethnic genocide thanks to the poison fed to them. And since the collapse of communism and the fall of the Berlin Wall, the flow of the poison that has been corrupting and destroying Western nations has only increased. In fact, since the 1990s, the madness that has been afflicting white people in what was the free West has increased exponentially, both in terms of its volume and its levels of toxicity. And this brings us to the modern day, where we, as people of European descent, stand upon the precipice of minority status. But earlier on I stated that this is not just a problem for the West, but it is in fact a problem faced by all decent, strong, ethnocentric and moral people the world over, regardless of their race or ethnicity. You see, the Judeo-American state is not content with simply corrupting and destroying white nations. Those in charge of America don't just want Europeans to suffer. They have set their sights not just on one part of the globe, but on the entire planet. And whilst those in Europe had to be approached in a more subtle way, they had to be paid off with poisons packaged as gifts that were supposed to bring nothing but pleasure and liberation. Elsewhere, that wasn't the case. Elsewhere, the Judeo-American state simply rolls in with tanks and troops and flattens entire nations with air and drone strikes, as those in the West sit watching the conflict on their television, being told that the latest conquest is not aggression, but instead liberation. And as such, is it any wonder that America is increasingly the most hated nation the world over? Is it any wonder that people in Europe, East Asia, the Indian subcontinent, and the Middle East all want to see America fall? Is it any wonder that the American flag is burnt in the streets of other nations and that America is referred to as the Great Satan? But for all the hate that so many people all over the world have for America, or more accurately, for the Judeo-American state, that hatred, despite its palpable energy and the numbers who feel it, is largely impotent. As all those in Europe, the Middle East and the world over who hate the USA cannot do a single thing to either harm the American state or to change the course that America is on. America is the greatest fortress nation the world has ever known. It cannot be assailed either by conventional forms of warfare or by the kind of mental attacks that it has aimed at other nations. No single country, or indeed no group of countries, have either the military power nor the propaganda arm necessary to make a dent in America's immeasurable and unbreakable armour. And all of that sounds pretty depressing, doesn't it? Europeans tricked into believing their forefathers stormed the beaches of Normandy to ensure that gay pride parades would take place in every Western city. People who lived in fear of the USSR tricked into thinking that the counterbalance to communism was in fact Western liberal democracy. White people conned into cheering for a hero sitting in Washington that was in fact just as much the villain as the monster sat in Moscow. Western families sat in front of the TV cheering as American tanks and bombs flattened sovereign nations and believing that such aggression brings liberty and freedom. Western men and women celebrating mass immigration and declaring that having children harms the planet. White people all over the world heading to minority status as their nations are slowly taken away from them. It all seems pretty hopeless. But that's actually why I wanted to come here. That's why I wanted to make this speech. That's why I wanted to address this wonderful meeting. Because despite everything I have said, I don't believe things are hopeless. And I don't believe everything is lost. And at this juncture, I would like to quote a great man, a man who fought on the side of those who really opposed both communism and liberal degeneracy, a man who fought against the Red Army in World War II. His name was Hans Rudel, and he said, "Only he is lost who gives himself up for lost." And I believe that now is not the time for losing faith or giving in. You see, I do have hope, as I believe the Judeo-American state can be defeated. But as I said earlier, that defeat will not come from an external force. It will not come from an invading army, and it will not come from outside pressure. Just as communism was not defeated by foreign tanks and guns or by external force, just as the USSR collapsed not from an invasion or from outside pressure, I believe the same will be true of the Judeo-American state. The real threat to those who control America does not come from the rest of the world. It comes from within America's own borders. It comes from the brave sons and daughters of the pioneers and explorers who founded this once great nation. It comes from those Americans willing to build an unashamedly pro-white and traditionalist community that advocates for our rights as a racial group. And this AMREN conference is full of something truly special. The descendants of some of the greatest Europeans that ever lived. You here today are the sons and daughters of those pioneers. You are the descendants of the explorers, inventors, warriors. You are the sons and daughters of the men and women who left Europe and conquered the New World. In your veins runs the blood of some of the greatest people who ever walked the earth. The blood of those who went west in wagons and tamed the New World's wild frontiers. And from out of that struggle was born America, the real America, a nation that was built by Europeans for Europeans, a nation built on real European values, family values, traditions, culture, and fundamentally, a nation built on the idea of white people taking their destiny into their own hands and forging their own path and weaving their own future. And you are not simply the descendants of the people who created America. You are the only people who can set America free. You are the only people who can reunite Americans as a proud, ethnocentric community. Let us be very clear. What America was intended to be by those who founded America is the antithesis of the modern-day Judeo-American state. And real Americans taking back control of their own destiny is not only the one thing that can free America from the Judeo-American state, but it is, in a very real sense, the one thing that can free the whole world from the poison that flows forth from the twisted version of America that exists today. Western liberal democracy is the poison that flows from occupied America, and the world's best hope in order to stop the flow of that poison is proud white Americans. You see, the irony is, for the anti-white American system to survive, the American state relies upon decent white Americans supporting it. And as such, The way to destroy this anti-white state is simple. Deny it of your support. Divorce yourselves from those who hate you. Stop funding this system. Stop buying into it. Stop propping it up. White people are still the backbone of America. And if you remove the backbone, the whole rotten beast will collapse to the ground. That is why it is time for white Americans to take on the spirit of their ancestors and once again become pioneers, for them to break away from their oppressive rulers just like their ancestors once did and start something new. And this is the reason why I am so banned and so censored. Not because I call for violence, quite the opposite. I call for peaceful separation because I know the ultimate truth. A homogeneous European society is far more likely to thrive and prosper than a multicultural one. And if we, as white people, walk away and create our own spaces, the multicultural society, without our support, will simply collapse under its own weight. A failed experiment that ironically only survives thanks to the white people it demonizes. Proud white Americans, rise up. Turn your back on the system that hates you. Walk away and create something better. Secure an existence for your people and a future for white children. And in doing so, you will not only save yourselves, but in turn, you will truly become the American heroes that will set the whole world free.
I believe that Mr. Collett has time for questions, and if you wish to ask him a question, please come forward to the microphone there. Now, will they be on camera if they are there? So, you can go ahead and ask a question, and he should be able to answer it live. Deo Valente.
Yeah, I want to thank you for your courage and your devotion. My question is, what's with Tommy Robinson? What's his problem? What's your analysis of him? I saw an interview where they asked him what he meant by the English people, and he said, well, the first was out of his mouth, not whites. And I would like to, your insight into what's his problem, what's with that guy?
Well, thank you for that very pertinent question. Tommy Robinson is one of those interesting little fellas who has just taken an all-expenses-paid trip to Israel, where he spent time kissing the wall with the little hat on. And the interview you are talking about is one conducted with an Israeli podcast host. And he was quite clear that he doesn't think English people are white. He doesn't think British people are white. In fact, he thinks both areas are fundamentally multicultural and multiracial. However, he is one of the counter-jihad talking heads, and a very prominent one. What he does is, whilst denying ethno-nationalism and denying that white people are the indigenous people of Europe, he constantly campaigns against Muslims as a narrow ethnic group, and then essentially tries to curry favour off the back of that for the state of Israel amongst indigenous British people who really don't have any interest in the Middle East, but have a major interest in ensuring that mass immigration comes to an end. But Tommy wants to reassure these people, well, if we just cool it with the Muslims, we should keep bringing the Afro-Caribbeans here and the Indians here. Well, white genocide is still white genocide, regardless of who replaces us. And paid for by the same lobby that controls the American government, unfortunately.
Muslims in large numbers are migrating to Europe and to a lesser extent to America. In the coming clash between Muslims and Jews in Europe, which side will you choose?
It's quite interesting you ask that question, because I reject the idea of this clash. If you look at Britain, Britain isn't merely two sides. People often talk about a race war, and I talk about this in my book, or a clash of cultures, but it's not really like that. If you come to Britain, you will see there are multiple different fractures between many different racial and cultural groups, including between Muslims. There are Sunnis, there are Shiites, there are Bangladeshi Muslims, Pakistani Muslims, there are Afro-Caribbeans, there are Indians, which fall into categories such as Hindu and Sikh. And what we're actually seeing in Britain is the emergence of a sectarian racial state that has more in common with something like Belfast in the 70s and 80s, but across multiple multiracial lines, rather than it being this clash of Islam versus the West. And this is very prominent in places like London, where if you go around London, you can see that every single area of London is almost ruled by a different ethnic group. They all cluster in different areas and advocate for their own interests. And each one of these groups brings almost a different set of problems to the next. And my call is essentially for white Britons, for the English, the Scots and the Welsh, not to go out there and sort of shill for either the Jewish community or the Muslim community, but instead to build their own ethnocentric communities so that they don't get essentially erased when the conflict between the different sectarian groups ramps up.
Thank you.
Mark, first of all, thank you so much for your patriotism. I'm sure there's millions upon millions of people who feel this way, and of course we feel badly for your plight. But at least from me, and I expect I speak for many people, thank you so much for your life's endeavors. Thank you. Now, my question is, I think we all agree that we want to create this now fallen original ethno-state and traditional culture. My question is to you, what is our next actionable steps? All of us here have this passion to extricate ourselves from this horror, but so few of us know what to do specifically, very, very, very specifically. So please tell us, what can we do very specifically to bring our cause to fruition? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for your very kind praise of my life's work. I think the next stage for people in America is actually a lot easier than the next stage for people in Europe. America is such a vast country, and you have so many beautiful, old-fashioned towns and cities throughout your great nation that are essentially dying, full of elderly white people, and you guys need to go and recapture them. You need to go as communities, take over these places, pick a place where you can all move to, and build your own vision of America, just like your ancestors did. When your ancestors didn't like what was happening in Europe, they went to America. And then when you fell out amongst yourselves and didn't like the way New York was being run, you went west in your wagons and tamed the country. You were amazing pioneers, explorers, and you built these amazing states. You just need to do the same again. You are the sons and daughters of your ancestors, and you need to emulate them. You have so much land, so much space where you can go, so many places where you can establish new homelands, new cities and towns where your wives and children will be safe. We don't have that luxury in Britain. We're this tiny nation where there's 70 million people packed into it, and we don't just have unpopulated towns we can go to or places where we could build a settlement. I think you people have that in your blood, and it's something I'm very, very envious of, because if I could do that, I would be very happy. But if you're not willing to make that move, you guys also can advocate freely thanks to your First Amendment rights, and advocacy and activism is also extremely important for those not willing to take the first step and establish something new.
Thank you.
Yes, hi. I wanted to ask about your assessment of the political situation in Britain, mostly in respect to the comparatively positive polling numbers for Reform UK.
Well, I actually welcome Reform UK, and the reason I welcome Reform UK is not because they're going to deliver us what we want. I'm under no illusion about what Nigel Farage offers. Nigel Farage offers us a little bit of a false start. He might reduce migration numbers, but I think he may well go back on a lot of his promises. But we have a problem in the UK, which you guys probably won't be too alien to. And that problem is we have two political parties that have existed for well over 100 years, and we have this false system of democracy where you end up voting for the party you dislike the least. So you vote Labour to get rid of the Tories, and then you vote Tory to get rid of Labour. And if we to ever get any change via the ballot box, which I'm not particularly enthusiastic or hopeful over in the first place, the first thing that must be done is the Tory party must be utterly crushed and destroyed. For well over 100 years, the Conservative Party have been offering people false hope, but people have been doggedly resistant to breaking away from that party. And what I'm hoping is that Reform is essentially the bulldozer that clears the political field, destroying the Conservatives completely and then mortally wounding and clipping the wings of the Labour Party. And I think if Reform does that, it will have at least done something good. And I think the other thing that Reform does is Nigel Farage has become increasingly radical with his rhetoric, and so have the Reform MPs, talking about the amount of diversity in adverts, talking about cities like Birmingham, where white people have essentially already been replaced and reduced to a minority. And the fact they're talking about these things gives us legitimacy when we speak to the public from an ethno-nationalist perspective. So I don't see Reform as the be-all and end-all, but I am happy about the prospect of us using them as a political wrecking ball.
Thank you.
Well, Mr. Collett, like all others, I thank you for this very, very informative program and for your kindness that you have shown those of us as Americans whose country has destroyed your country and destroyed the British Empire and is trying to destroy Europe. I was blessed in life with a father who thought for himself and who was aware of our British heritage. He was a clergyman of the church of what you call the Church of Scotland, and we were reminded of that at all times. And one of the great things he told us was the wickedness of July the 4th and how we are marinated every July 4th in hate propaganda against what we were and are. That we're taught that there's something new in this country and that our European and specifically British ancestry is all wicked and botched and offered us nothing. So this is a poor question to you, but it's addressed mostly to the audience. You know, I would like to know what we could do to change this July 4th rhetoric and make people see that we are an extension of Britain and Europe and not its enemy. And finally, I'd like to thank you again and tell you that hearing your speech made me proud to be a member of the people of Hengist and Horsa.
Thank you so much. I think that the multiple anti-white propaganda outlets in America have done everything they can to make other white people the enemies of Americans while telling Americans that every migrant group that comes to America are their friends and are going to enrich it. So you guys are told that the English were the bad guys because, you know, the English were the Americans' enemies originally. But then the Germans were also the bad guys for the whole Second World War. And then, obviously, Russians and Eastern Europeans were the bad guys through the Cold War. And you start to see this sort of pattern that everyone portrayed as a bad guy in Hollywood propaganda. And we know who owns Hollywood in Hollywood propaganda. You know, they're always white. It's either the British colonialists, the German Nazis, the Eastern European white communists who curiously are never portrayed as who they actually were, the people I spoke about in my speech. And that's always been sort of complemented by this idea that black Americans are the heroes. Immigrants that come to America are the real spirit of America and are going to be your friends. And I think this is all a carefully woven lie. And as myself, as a proud Englishman, I bear no ill will to Americans. I love you guys. I do lots of shows with you guys. It was the greatest honour personally for me to be invited to speak at AmRen, because I have so much respect for Jared Taylor and what he's done and what you guys do. This is, I was saying to the wife before I left home, this is sort of the proudest moment probably of the last few years for me, and definitely the highlight of my year. You know, we love you guys, and this idea that brothers' wars are somehow honourable and good and we should be at each other's throats is pure Hollywood fantasy. We are all brothers and we should all work together against the anti-white evil.
Sir? Your speech did not say much about the Islamist threat to Europe. Could you address a few remarks towards that?
There is definitely an Islamist threat to Europe. I'm not denying that. And obviously we have experienced things such as the Pakistani Muslim grooming gangs, where hundreds of thousands of white British girls have been raped. However, the way I look at this is I tend to look at the people opening the gate and point to them before I just look at the people rushing through the gate. And when you look at the problems we face in Europe, it truly is a multiracial problem. Yes, Muslims have brought many problems to Europe, and yes, I don't want them here. In fact, I'd go as far to say I don't want a single mosque remaining in Europe. But I also can't overlook people like the Nottingham spree killer, Valdo Calacane, who went on a spree killing in Nottingham in 2023, or Axel Ruda Cabana, who stabbed 3 beautiful young white girls to death in Southport. I also can't overlook Anthony Williams, who just earlier this year went on a stabbing spree on a train in Huntingdon, and all of them were black men. I understand Islam poses a threat to the West, but mass immigration is very much multifaceted. And if you look at cities like Birmingham and London, yes, they do have Muslim enclaves, both Sunni and Shiite, but they also have Afro-Caribbean enclaves. And there's also an awful lot of crime, especially knife and machete crime, that is carried out by other ethnic groups. I want to be absolutely clear. I would like a white supermajority in this country, and by that I'm talking 95% white British, and I certainly do not want mosques, Hindu temples, synagogues, or any other places of worship for that matter on British soil. But make no mistake, this is a multifaceted, sectarian, multiracial problem. But yes, Islam is a huge problem, and I've spent a lot of my life campaigning against that, and I was tried between 2004 and 2006 for making speeches about the grooming scandal long before Tommy Robinson even entered politics. So it was actually me who was the first person in Britain to be put on trial for raising the alarm about the issue of Pakistani Muslim grooming gangs. So it's certainly not something that I ignore or play down.
Mr. Collett, this is Jared Taylor, thanking you for your impassioned delivery and thanking you for all you've done for our people. But we have to stick to our schedule despite your fascinating replies to fascinating questions. Again, thank you very much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.